Good morning, everybody. Hope that you are having a great Sunday morning so far. Glad that you guys are here. We are in week 1. We are starting a brand new series, and our lights malfunctioned in the back, but they're going to get on in just a second. Don't worry. We are starting a brand new series called Follow the Leader. And here's the idea behind the series. How many of you remember when you were in elementary school? For some of you, you're going to have to think just like maybe a couple of months, but for some of you, you're going to have to think like a couple of more months back. But think back to when you were in elementary school about the games that you played, right? Like, you guys remember the game Follow the Leader? You know, you don't really get to play these games as an adult. They don't like have an adult Follow the Leader league or anything. Maybe you guys should start that, like an adult Duck Duck Goose league or something. You guys should try to revolutionize that. That would be good. But when you were a kid and you played this game Follow the Leader, essentially one of you would get to be the leader. You'd go to the front of the line, and then everybody had to follow you and do everything that you would do. Anybody remember that game as a kid? Okay, well, here's what happened. A few of you, the rest of you need to get out more. But what would happen is you would follow the leader, and they would end up doing some crazy things, and you would follow, and it was really, really fun. Well, what happened in the New Testament was there was this guy named Jesus, who you may have heard of, and he came around and he asked this group of people that would ultimately become known as the disciples. And the reason they were called the disciples is because disciple means follower. And he would come and he would ask these disciples, who weren't his disciples at the time, to follow him. And when they followed him, it changed their lives. It was completely revolutionary. Nobody had ever done a disciple the way that Jesus did disciple. And we'll explain what that means in just a second, but it was completely revolutionary. And here's my hope. Here's my prayer for this series. What I want for more than anything is for us to leave this 6-week period of time taking our relationship with Jesus and following him way more seriously than we do right now. So here's what I need. Everybody ready for a big, big commitment that you're about to make? Everybody ready? Okay, here's what I need from you. I want you to commit to this series. And what I mean by that is I want you to commit to being here for the entire 6 weeks. I know 6 weeks, that seems crazy, right? Some of you sign your kids up for like an 18-week soccer course league. And you're there every single time, so I know you can do it. And if for some reason, like you've already got something planned on a Sunday, which you should never do, but if you already have something planned on a Sunday and you can't make it, you can always check online and you can watch what you missed. But I want to encourage you to make sure that you catch every single one of these Sundays, because I think it has the potential to really, really change your life. And I think it has potential to be really, really, really good. So make sure that you catch it all. Everybody good with that? You ready? Okay, you should get a little more excited. I'm excited. You need to be a little more excited. You know, first service was like half this size, and I won't even go there. But anyway, so here's the way we're going to start this. We're going to kind of start today with like a simple invitation, just a simple thing that Jesus said that was life-transforming. And then over the next 5 weeks, we're going to talk about some of the biggest things that Jesus told his disciples, his followers, that was just revolutionary. You know what one of my favorite parts about history is that there was this group of people around the turn of the first century that were able to completely transform the world. Just 12 guys and a handful of other people. Whether you believe in Jesus or you're not sure, it doesn't matter. You can't deny the fact that there was a handful of people that completely transformed the world and transformed the history of the world from that moment forward. And it's amazing to think about how just one guy asked them to follow him, and everything that we have now when it comes to Jesus and church and Christianity is here. It's incredible to think about. And so I'm going to ask you guys a question, or actually it's a question that you're going to ask yourself. Are you ready for this question? The question is this: am I following? Am I following? And what I mean by that is this: that the reality is, when Jesus was walking around on the earth and he had his group of disciples, do you guys realize that there were actually 3 different groups of people that followed Jesus around? That it wasn't just his followers, his disciples that followed him around, that there were 3 different groups of people. The first group of people was like this extremely religious elite group of people. They were known as the scribes or Pharisees or Sadducees or rabbis. They were Jewish rabbis, and they thought they knew the law inside and out. They thought they were perfect at the law, and they would follow Jesus around, but not for the same reason that other groups would follow Jesus around. They followed Jesus around because they were extremely skeptical about him. They wanted nothing more. They were like, hey, we're a rabbi. You claim to be a rabbi. You claim to be a teacher, but you didn't go to rabbi school like we did. What is your problem? Why do you claim to do that? Why do you teach the way that you teach? And why do you do the things that you do? And so what they would do is they would follow him around, waiting on him to make a mistake, waiting on him to say something or do something that would upset them. And then they would be like, see, we told you Jesus is a fake. We want him arrested, or worse, we want him killed. And they eventually got him killed. But that's what this first group of people would do. Then there was this other group of people that we're going to call the crowd. Everybody say crowd. Just making sure you're awake. Good. There was this group of people called the crowd, and they would follow Jesus around, but they weren't necessarily skeptical. They were just excited. They loved seeing everything that Jesus did. There was this one time that Jesus turned water into wine, and they were like, can you do that every day? That would be really fantastic, Jesus. And there was this one time he turned like just a small basket of food into food that could feed thousands of people. They were like, we want that all the time. Jesus, that is the Jesus we want to see. And they would follow him, and they would see all these miracles that he was doing, and they would see these words that he would say that they had never heard before, and it just completely blew their minds. And so they were like, we want to follow him around. But at the end of the day, they would go home, not having really learned anything, just seeing something crazy happen. And then when things began to get hard and the Roman officials began pressing in, guess where they all went? Away, nowhere to be found. There was a crowd of people that would have maybe even called themselves Jesus followers, but they weren't Jesus followers. And then you had the last group, and those were the 12 guys and a handful of other people that followed Jesus around, not just to see the miracles, not because they were skeptical, but because they wanted to learn, because they wanted to grow, because they wanted to become more Jesus-like in their lives. And let me tell you, you want to hear something really fun? There are all three of those groups present in this room right now. There are people that are here that are kind of maybe weary of life, and you're just kind of like, you know what, I'm not sure I believe this. My wife made me come. Somebody promised me lunch if I stopped by this place on the way, and I didn't realize it was going to be all this, and I'm done with this whole thing, and you're skeptical, and you're just waiting to prove one more thing that proves to you that this isn't legit, that this isn't real. Some of those people are in this room right now, and for some of you, you're here because church is the thing that you do on Sunday mornings. You're not necessarily a follower of Jesus in the sense that you want to become more like him and you want to get into his word and you want to grow. You're just kind of here to see the spectacle. You're kind of here to eat the brownies out in the lobby that are really good today, right? You're kind of just here to hang out, right? And it's something that you do when it's convenient for you, but it's not something that you're doing because you're all in, ready to follow. But then there are people here this morning also that are here because they want to become closer to Jesus in their life than they've ever been before. And I want to tell you, wherever you are in that mix, it is okay. We are so glad that you are here. And what I want desperately more than anything else for this entire series is for us to walk away at the end of this 6 weeks, for every single one of us to walk away saying, you know what? I am committed. I am surrendered to following Jesus with everything that I have from this moment forward. And I don't want to just settle to be a skeptic that sits in the crowd and waits for Jesus to mess up. I don't want to be the person who is just looking at what Jesus is going to do next, but I want to be the person that is going to follow him so closely that it radically transforms my life. That is my prayer for every single one of us. And I hope that you're ready to let that happen in your life, because it can, right where you are. Now, just to kind of get started here, the word Christian means so many. Like if I were to ask everybody in this room today to define what a Christian is, we would probably get like 20 or 30 different definitions, right? And if you ask somebody out on the street, what does it mean to be a Christian, or are you a Christian, we might get a different response for every person, right? Let's just do a quick little word association here. If I were to say to you, what do you think of when you think of the word football fan? Right, what you don't usually think of is a person sitting on their couch on a Saturday afternoon eating nachos, just kind of casually watching a game. That's not what instantly comes to your mind. This is what instantly comes to your mind. Because we tend to think extreme and fanatic when we think about things, right? What about this? What if I said, what do you think of when you hear the word NASCAR fan? you probably think of this, right? Person with the 3 shaved into his back, and you're probably right. Pretty much all NASCAR fans are like that. I'll give you that one. But we tend to think in extremes when we think of these kind of things, and that's just the way we wired it. And people tend to think in extremes when it comes to this idea of Christianity too. And I think that has honestly given us kind of a distorted sense of what Christianity really is. Even in the church, I think that we have a Christian crisis in our culture. Okay, a Christian crisis, whereas I don't think we really understand what it means to be a Christian. The way that Christian is defined in our culture, honestly, is somebody who simply believes in Jesus and may attend a church. That's kind of the way that we've described it. But Jesus never set out to build a church of people full of Christians. He didn't do that. What he wanted was to build a church that was full of disciples. You guys realize in the Bible they didn't even call themselves Christians? You guys know in Acts chapter 11 when they were first, when the church, when Peter, James, and John, these guys, you know when they were first called Christians? It was in a city called Antioch. And they were actually being insulted when people called them that. It was a slur. It was something that they were called that was supposed to demean them, to defame them. You guys know how many times the word Christian appears in the Bible? 3. But do you guys know how many times the word disciple or follower appears in the New Testament? 281. That is a huge difference in what Jesus really was trying to build, and what he wanted to do was to have a group of people who were committed to not just saying they were Christians, meaning I say I believe the right things and I go to church when it's convenient for me, but rather he was committed to building a group of people who wanted to follow him with everything that they had. And so this series, I want us to commit to being that type of church. I want you to commit to being that type of person, a person that follows no matter what, with everything that you got. So, in order to do that, I want to tell you 2 stories today. And what you're going to learn from these stories is that you are already, no matter where you are, no matter what you're going through, you are already pre-qualified. Do you ever get those letters in the mail that says you're pre-qualified? You know, to pay like 28% interest for the rest of your life? Pre-qualified, you get those? Makes you feel really special, right? Well, today, you are already, no matter where you are, who you are, or what you're going through, you are already pre-qualified to be a follower of Jesus. No matter who you are, what you've been through, or what you're doing currently, you are pre-qualified. And check out these 2 stories. They are really, really, really phenomenal. Matthew chapter 4 is the first story. Matthew chapter 9 is the second, if you have your Bible. If not, we're going to throw them up on the screen behind me. Matthew chapter 4, verses 18 through 22. It goes something like this. As Jesus was walking beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw 2 brothers, Simon, called Peter, and his brother Andrew. They were casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. Come, help me out with this next 2 words. Come, follow me, Jesus said, and I will send you out to fish for people. At once they left their nets and followed him. Does that seem weird to anybody else? Seems a little weird to me. And then it says, going on from there, he saw 2 other brothers, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John. And they were in a boat with their father Zebedee. What an incredible name. If you have a baby this year, boy or girl, Zebedee, that's the name. Preparing their nets, and Jesus called them. And immediately they left the boat and their father and followed him. I am not making fun if your name is Zebedee. Glad you're here. I've often found this really, really curious because, like, whenever I've seen this, like, depicted in, like, a movie or like, a picture, you always, like, see this, like, you know, Jesus walk up in, like, this really baggy, like, bathrobe with, like, a blue sash, right? And he walks up, and they've never seen him before. They're out working hard on their boat, and he, like, walks up, and he's just, like, pulls some kind of Jedi trick on them, and he's just like, follow me. And they're like, what? Okay, let's do it, right? And like, that doesn't happen. Like, if somebody walked up to you at work tomorrow and they were just like, follow me, and you had never seen them before, you wouldn't be like, you know what, you're right, I'm quitting my job right now, let's do this, crazy guy. You wouldn't do it. That's not the way the world works. And the same thing with James and John. It doesn't make sense. And so I started trying to think, well, we got to dig a little bit deeper into this, and let me try to explain what's really going on and why they wanted to follow Jesus from this point forward. This is so cool. At the age of 5, think back to when you were 5 and you started kindergarten. If you were a boy in Hebrew, in Israel, in the Hebrew culture, At 5 years old, you would go to what we're going to call Torah school. Now, the Torah is the first 5 books of the Old Testament. So none of the Matthew, Mark, Luke, none of that stuff. Old Testament, thinking Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Those are the first 5 books of the Old Testament. If you were 5 years old, you instantly, if you were a boy and you wanted to, you got to go to Torah school. And for the next 5 years, you spent time learning, and this is how you would learn to read, how you would learn to write. You would learn the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Then, at 5 years old, there was a cut that was about to be made. Okay? This is like, me thinking back to high school basketball all over again, getting cut from the team. At 10 years old, if you hadn't shown promise, if you hadn't shown enough potential, if you were not the best and brightest, the best of the best, they would say, all right, it's time to cut you. You no longer get to study. Now, if you were the best and the brightest, if you were one of the highlights of the class, they would say, okay, you're ready to go on and you're going to learn the rest of the Old Testament. You're going to learn Joshua through Malachi for the next 7 or 8 years. But if you didn't, that meant at 10 years old, you were ready to go ahead and begin your career. You would go join your family. At 10 years old, you would go join your family in whatever your family career was, whether that was farming, you would go be a farmer. If it was fishing, you would go be a fisherman. If your family owned the local 7-Eleven, you would go and make Slurpees. Whatever it was, that was what you went to go do. At 10 years old, I have a 10-year-old. I can't imagine her starting a career this year. And you can't imagine your 10-year-old starting a career this year. You probably can't even imagine your 20-year-old starting a career this year. But here's the thing. At 17, 18 years old, at that point, if you were still the best and the brightest, see, at 17, 18, if you weren't the best and the brightest, they would cut you again, but at least you knew the whole Old Testament. And what I mean by knew it, you probably had a lot of it memorized, and you could preach it and teach it whenever. And if you were the best and the brightest at the age of 17 or 18 years old, what would happen next is that you got to go, if you wanted to, you got to go and choose a rabbi to learn under. Now, this is really important. If you were in first century Palestine, you wanted to be a rabbi. They didn't have like the NBA, NFL. They didn't have rock stars. They didn't have any of that thing. As a boy, you grew up wanting to be a rabbi. You grew up wanting to be a pastor. I think that that's still true today, right? That's just what everybody wants to do. Because rabbis in that culture were actually wealthy. They were important. They were like the cornerstone of the community. Everybody loved them. And people looked at them with this like sense of perfection until Jesus came along. Everybody kind of looked at them with this sense of perfection. And so you wanted to be a rabbi. And so at 17 years old, 18 years old, when you graduated from Torah school, you would go and you would try to find a rabbi, and you got to choose the rabbi that you wanted to learn under. And what you would do in this ceremony, you would go and you would sit at his feet. That was his way of knowing you chose him. And at that point, he had to decide whether or not he was going to choose you. And so you would, at that point, he would begin asking you questions, putting you through a series of tests to deem whether you were worthy enough to be his follower, to deem whether you were worthy enough to be his disciple, to be his student. And if he wasn't, then you're off to the 7-Eleven. But if you were, you got the opportunity to follow him around for however many years it took until you were ready to be a rabbi yourself. And it would take sometimes years and years and years, and they were very selective. They didn't just let anybody through. And you would follow your rabbi all over the place. Matter of fact, one of the greatest compliments that could be said about you was that the dust of your rabbi was all over you. Try using that compliment at work tomorrow. It'll go over really, really well. The dust of your rabbi is all over you. In other words, what it's saying is, everywhere that he's been, you have been. Everything that he has been through, you have been through, because you are following so closely. That was their goal. And so when Jesus walked onto the scene, these guys had all been rejected. None of them had been chosen. And check this out. This is even better. There was this thing that some rabbis had and some actually most did not. Very, very few had. It's called simcha. Everybody say simcha. You're all Hebrew experts now. You can put that on your resume. Simcha. And what simcha translates to is authority. Authority. You may have been reading the New Testament, and you may have seen a part where it said, Jesus taught as one who had authority. Right? And I never understood this before, but that was actually a real thing. This simcha is a thing that was ascribed to certain rabbis, meaning that they basically had the Old Testament memorized, and they couldn't not only just teach it or recite it, but they could teach new ways to look at it that nobody had ever thought about before. And they could perform miracles. You had to have at least 2 miracles under your belt to have authority as a rabbi. And you had to have 2 other rabbis with authority, put that authority on you. So this is like a select group of people that not just anybody. Matter of fact, there were only a handful of rabbis in the first century that we know of that had simica or authority on them. But Jesus came along. You know what people said about him? He said, "You teach like somebody that has simica. Where did you get it? How did you get this?" Jesus, did he perform miracles? Yeah. Did he teach the Old Testament in ways that nobody had ever heard before? He was doing it at 12 years old. He was teaching the rabbis these things. So Jesus had this authority. And so when Jesus walked out on that beach that day and he saw James and John and Andrew and Peter, and he said to them, "Hey, I want you to follow me." They had been hearing stories about this Jesus guy who had authority. And they had been rejected for the rabbi program. They had been rejected and told, "You're not good enough. You go be fishermen." And now a rabbi, and not just any rabbi, a rabbi with authority, with simica, comes to them and says, "Hey, I don't want you to come and ask me if you can be my disciple. And I'm not going to put you through a series of tests." Jesus is operating on a different game plan. He says, "I'm going to come and I'm going to ask you right where you are, the B team, the ones who couldn't get it done, the rejected ones. I want you to come and follow me and learn from me." And at this point, they weren't just like, "Okay, this is a crazy guy." They were like, "This is what we've always wanted. I want to come and I want to learn from a rabbi, from Jesus, the new guy who's got authority. I'm going to go and I'm going to follow him so that I can become like him." And it was life transforming for them. And so I want you to understand something really, really important. If you think you're not qualified, this is so important to understand. Just because you don't feel qualified to be a Jesus follower does not disqualify you. As a matter of fact, it is probably a prerequisite. These guys weren't qualified. They didn't feel qualified, but Jesus chose them to follow him. 2 simple words. Will you follow me? And it changed the course of their life forever because they committed to following him right where they were. Second story is found in the book of Matthew, a few chapters up. It's about a guy named Matthew. That's correct. Matthew wrote a story about Matthew, and we were creative enough to call that story Matthew. That's how we roll. Matthew chapter 9, Jesus walks up to this dock area by a lake, and he's already got a few of his disciples with him. But check out how this goes. It says, as Jesus went on from there, he saw a man named, there's our guy, Matthew, sitting at the tax collector's booth. Now, why do you think he was sitting at a tax collector's booth? You guys got that so much quicker than first service. They were like, "Because he's Matthew." I was like, no. Because he was a tax collector. Because he was a tax collector. And if you guys don't understand what this means, like, you probably are not overly fond of the IRS right now, and I get that. But here's the thing. If you lived in the first century, you would have been so irate about tax collectors. Think of like the worst thing that you can possibly think of that a person could do right now. You know, selling drugs to kids, probably worse things than that. And then to put that level of anger that you have about that thing onto tax collectors, because that's how people felt about them in the first century. It was the worst thing you could do, because what would happen is Rome, the Roman Empire, the Roman government, they wanted desperately to tax to the point of just complete control. They would tax these regions that they've conquered. And Israel was one of those regions. Palestine was one of those regions. And so they said, "We're going to put taxes on you." And they would actually auction out the opportunity to tax these people. And these wealthy Romans would come and they would buy these opportunities. And they would say, "Okay, you're in charge of the tax. Here's how much Rome needs to get. You can have whatever's left." And so this was an incredibly lucrative opportunity for these people to go, and they would make money. And then what they would do is they would hire local people in that community to collect the taxes all over the place. And they had a tax for everything. And Matthew was one of those guys. And what that meant was that he was instantly cut off from the rest of his people. They shunned him. He wasn't even allowed to eat with them anymore. He said, "You go and eat by yourself or with other tax collectors and sinners. You're not even allowed to. You can't come to church. You cannot come to the temple." They kicked him out of church because he was a tax collector. They said, you can't even know God anymore because you're a tax collector. That's how much he was hated. And now Jesus walks up to Matthew. Remember, he's got Peter and James and John and Andrew. He's got these guys with him. Not all of his disciples, but he's starting to form his posse. And he walks up to Matthew. And check out what he says to Matthew. He says, follow me. Now at this point, if I'm Peter and I'm Andrew and I'm James and I'm John, I'm like, did he just say follow me? I think he just walked up to a tax collector that we all hate, and he said the same thing that he said to me. He wants Matthew, the one that everybody hates, to come with us. They're like, Jesus, are you sure about this? Because, if he comes with us, that means he's with us, but we're definitely not with him. I'm not sure you want to do this. But of course, Matthew's making a lot of money, right? So he's not going to get up and walk, and he's not going to go with Jesus, right? What happens next in the story? And Matthew got up and followed him. What? So now you got a bunch of fishermen. I can understand why they may want to come out. Fish smells disgusting. So I understand why they may want to come and follow Jesus. But now you got Matthew, who has been cut off from his people, but he's making a lot of money doing it, and he wants to follow Jesus? That's odd. That's weird. And what's so amazing about this story is that Jesus often did this. He would go to places and he would go to people who were nothing like him, and they loved him. And he would risk his reputation. He would risk his opportunities with certain groups of people, and he would go and he would talk to people who were supposedly a lower status than him. He would walk into Samaria, a place where Jews were not allowed to go or should never go, and he would talk to a Samaritan woman who a Jewish man would never talk to, and he would do it to show his love for people. It was incredible that people who were unlike Jesus loved him, and he loved people who were unlike him. The people who had the biggest problem with him were the people who thought they were already perfect, the religious leaders that followed him around. Well, check out what happens next. Matthew chapter 9, verse 10. It says this, while Jesus was having dinner at Matthew's house. Well, that escalated quickly. Could you imagine being Peter being like, wait a second, time out. We're going to his house now? Wait, I thought he was just going to come around with us, like stand a few feet behind us, but now you got us going to his house? We can't go to his house. They probably got tax collector cooties there. We are not going into that place. This is absolutely absurd. But while Jesus was having dinner at Matthew's house, it actually gets worse. Check out what happens next. Many tax collectors and sinners, and I love how they separate that. Sinners are like, don't call us tax collectors. We're not that bad. We may be the bottom of the barrel. We may be sinners, but at least we're not tax collectors, right? Keep us separate. But many tax collectors came and ate with him and his disciples. So you imagine Peter and John just sitting there like, why are we here? This is ridiculous. And they just sat there and they ate. And Jesus did this all the time. He loved people who were unlike him, and people who were unlike him loved him. And he went on from this place to let Matthew walk with him. And check out what happens next. The Pharisees, that group of people that hated him, remember? When the Pharisees saw this, they asked his disciples, why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? Because we would never do that. They're probably looking in the window asking this question. We would never go in there. We are better than that. And on hearing this, Jesus said, it's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. And I bet Matthew's like, wait a second. You think I'm sick? And Jesus probably looked at him and said, Matthew, you're a tax collector. Yes, you're sick. And so is everybody else, but I am still inviting you to follow me. And not just follow me around, but to become my follower, to become my disciple, to become my student. And Matthew and James and John and all the others, they set out on this journey to follow Jesus. A couple things I want you to know about this. Number one, being a sinner, like we learned from Matthew here, being a sinner does not disqualify you. In fact, it is a prerequisite. And Jesus, no matter where you are, no matter what you've done, no matter what you're doing currently, no matter what you're addicted to, Jesus wants you to commit to this moment being his follower. Number two, being an unbeliever does not disqualify you. There was this really cool moment I had a couple years ago. when I'm reading through the New Testament, and remember Jesus called all these disciples, and he walked with them for like 2 years. And then there was this moment in Scripture that said, and then the disciples believed. I was like, what were they doing for the last 2 years? They were following, and they were learning, and they were growing. But they didn't all believe. There was one of them who got a nickname that he's forever going to have, named Doubting Thomas, because he doubted. Even after Jesus had risen from the dead, he doubted. And so if you're here this morning and you're like, I can't be a follower of Jesus because I've got so many doubts, because I'm just not so sure about all this. I'm telling you, your doubt does not disqualify you. You can still commit to being a follower of Jesus right where you are. And if you have doubts, that's okay. They did too. And you can grow through those doubts. And the third thing, I want you to really get this. This is an invitation to a relationship. This isn't an invitation to follow all the rules and make yourself perfect before you become a follower of Jesus. That's what a lot of churches teach, but that's not the reality. The reality is this is an invitation to a relationship. Think about when you got married, or think about if you're not married yet and you're going to be one day. Imagine that you get to the front to marry the person and they pull out a list of rules. They're like, these are my marriage rules. And before you can say yes to me, your vows have to include that you're going to obey every single one of these rules. You think there would be more or less marriages happening? Probably a few less, but that's not what happens. You commit to a relationship with a person and you figure out the rules as you go, because you're in a love relationship with that person. And so Jesus invites you into a relationship where you get to follow him closely. And what I want more than anything is for you to commit today, no matter where you are, to this simple invitation that Jesus gives you to say, I'm going to follow you. So here's the question. Am I following? Or am I just coming to church and sitting, listening, being okay with what's happening, and then going home? Brownies were good today. That's great. Or am I willing to say, you know what? No matter where I'm at in my journey, from this moment forward, I want to actually be a follower, a disciple, someone who walks so closely with Jesus that the dust of my rabbi is all over me. I want to be that kind of follower. And I want you to be that kind of follower. So today, you don't have to change anything this week. This is like the easiest homework ever. All you have to do is make a change in the way that you think, maybe a change in your heart to say, I commit myself to being a follower of Jesus. Not just a Christian who comes to church and says, I believe the right things, but I want to commit myself to following Jesus with all my heart. And just see what he does with you over these next 5 weeks and beyond. If you guys want to stand, I just want to pray for us today. Father, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here today. God, help us to take seriously this question that you ask, this invitation that you give. Will you follow me? Not just will you come to church occasionally, not just will you say you believe the right things, but will you really come close and follow and become my disciple? God, help that be true of every single one of us here today. Help us to make the commitment to follow you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Amen. You guys have a great Sunday. We will see you back next week at 9 or 10:30. Have a great day, guys.